So this conversation is a very relaxed, quasi-informal conversation, but nonetheless, I hope it will be informative and, more importantly, insightful into some of the background and personalities, and I'm hoping for a lot of gossip and stories of previous times as well. But maybe just to sort of set the stage a little bit, as Dr. Wells mentioned, so today was the new Student Precinct event, sort of launching it in a much more formal way, a kind of festival of what we hope to have happen as the development goes along. But the background to that is that there was a competition process in order to select the teams to do the development for the new Student Precinct. And I was fortunate to be a member of the jury, but also to be involved in trying to understand what was the kind of composition of a team. And we really wanted the teams that, first of all, made their submissions, and then those that were shortlisted, and then the selection, to truly be that, to be a team, not to be just a big name, single practice that could handle everything. Not that there aren't practices like that throughout Melbourne, but given the nature of the new Student Precinct, the sort of diversity of activities that go there, a really challenge to think differently about what those facilities might be on behalf of students, as well as the greater academic and university community, as well as the precinct and the neighborhood around here. We felt it really important that the selected team would really have a diversity of experience, diversity of knowledge, and in fact bring a lot of questioning to the collaboration. So not just following one line, but questioning many possibilities. And hopefully out of that, we felt that we would achieve much more dynamic, much more interrogative, and therefore a much more imaginative solution to, in fact, questions we weren't even sure what they should be. So we were very fortunate that this incredible team, of which these are only 2 members, so remember the team, it's another 5 or 6 or 7 design professionals between architecture, at least architects, landscape architects, placemakers, urban designers, and as well as the whole consultancy team and such. So we thought it would be really useful tonight to hear from both Julie and Carey, not really about the project. So we're not here to sort of explain the new Student Precinct project, but really to talk about some of the history of both these individuals, but also of this institution, this university, this Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning, and the degree to which those ideas may have been nascent 30 years ago? Can I say 40 years ago?
40 years ago.
40 years ago. And where they are now. So, you know, in the background, there will be images passing through of times past as little reference points. So I want to begin by first asking Julie to say a few words, and particularly to tell us what it was that brought her to the University of Melbourne, and what was it like to be a student architect in the 70s?
Yeah, I started 72.
That's when I started, but not here.
You weren't, oh good, I thought I'd forgotten you already. Is my mic on?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so...
and feel free to have a drink.
Feel free to have a drink. So I came to architecture school because I didn't feel confident enough to go to art school, and I didn't feel that I wanted to write essays on end. And I came into the architecture school, and there was a guy with a club foot called Mr. Caldecott, and he taught structures, and his wife, Beth Caldecott, also taught structures. And I spoke to him, and I said, I'm thinking of doing architecture, what do you think? And he said, it doesn't really matter what you do, it's a great education. And I thought, wow, I never thought of it that way. And that's kind of why I ended up, because it had drawing, it had environmental stuff, it had history, it had such a gamut of knowledge that you were presented with. And then I got in, and then I came, and that's kind of how I started. What did you do, Carey? Did you have any? Well, you come from a family of architects. You got a whole problem. Yeah.
I came with baggage.
Yeah, you did.
You know, as many would know, my father was an architect. My mother was an interior designer. My two uncles were architects. My grandfather was an architect.
Oh my God.
And I had,
This is
and
not.
I had my two older brothers preceding me in the Bachelor of Architecture course at Melbourne University. So
I don't think this is
but
baggage.
I think this
is
was
a
an
storage
independent
shed.
thinker in any case, and I chose to do architecture for my own reasons. But so I started in 1977, finished in 1982. I mean, the thing that I was relating to others today that distinguishes that period, which many of you, if you're students here now, will not think is even able to be contemplated, that from 1974, when Gough Whitlam came in as the Prime Minister of Australia, he implemented free university education. But it only lasted from 1974 till 1984, when John Dawkins was the Education Minister under Bob Hawke, and it was ended and HECS fees came in. So I was 77 to 82, so I was right in pretty much the only sweet spot of getting a completely free...
72 was, oh no, you had to pay union fees.
Yeah, completely free education. So it's sort of interesting, I mean, we can sort of talk about this, that you know, you were more tolerated as a student rather than, you know, having a whole project called the New Student Precinct, where students are, in a sense, fee paying, and you know, they've got scholarship, but they're also, in a sense, customers of the university. So it was a completely different vibe for the education, the way the school was run. All the staff were tenured, so many had been here for a long time. I mean, I might be brave enough to say many had been here for perhaps too long.
Julie?
I want to go back to Gough Whitlam, because without Gough Whitlam, I would never have met my architect husband in first year of architecture school, because he eliminated the draft. And I think 3 or 4 of my very good friends, including him, would not have been in architecture school. So that's 72. And those papers came in that the draft would be, I don't remember when the election was that year, but it must have been just before school started, something like that. So, you know, you talk about Grant Morani from Halftime Club, he was conscripted, Hank was conscripted. So these were, you know, this was lucky days. And there was a rebellious spirit, there was a lot of questioning of authority, and it basically meant that nobody trusted anything that was the institution. I think now we trust our educational institutions more, and notwithstanding that the people I know in education in this school are good and great, I think we trust them too much. I think there's not enough questioning happening. And we were just in an era where your first response was no, not yes, or how do I get there? So I think that critical thinking was really important to me, and that state of mind I never lost. To me, it's more important not to do as you're told, but to work out what it is you think you should do, and if it corresponds, that's good. And if you're going to go back to stories, I'll tell you how Hank and I nearly got expelled from the university. So getting back to the issue of authority, we didn't really think the department was being run all that well. We were 19, I mean, we knew a lot. And we thought that there was no space for students, and we demolished partitions on the 4th floor of the old architecture school to make a student lounge. And we thought this was a pretty good idea, and the offices were vacant anyway. And we got pulled up to whatever the tribunal was called, and they kept asking us, did you know what you were doing? And we said, of course we knew what we were doing. Why do you think we did it? And we finally, because again at 19 you're not as smart as you think you are, we worked out that what they wanted us to say was, no we didn't, because otherwise they would have had to discipline us and throw us out. So we worked out soon enough that that was the answer. But I think that sort of story is the story of that kind of era, of the era of students not really feeling that, it gets back to your point, we weren't customers, we were kind of tolerated. in an environment and that you had to depend a lot on your own ability to pull up opportunities. Now, I think it's a pretty naive idea what I'm projecting, because it wasn't that unstructured, and I sure learnt a lot. And we had some incredible faculty back then. I'm rambling, but I'm on jet lag, so you'll have to forgive me. But do you agree? Before I keep talking too much.
No. I mean, as an example of just the sort of free education, we were always in arguments with the faculty of the school at the time about access to studio space. Because it wasn't just like you'd have a laptop then and open it up anywhere. You had to have a drawing board and a T-square and all that kind of stuff. But you were not given access to studios on a permanent basis, so you couldn't put down roots. You couldn't. I'm not sure what the arrangement is here if you're doing like your major thesis, whether or not you can occupy the building. So some things don't change. Why aren't they revolting against that, Don?
Yeah.
Well, I think it changed in between. But now I think all of the major schools of architecture in Australia, there's no, or very few, where you have dedicated studio space that you keep for a semester or for a whole year.
Yeah. So you'll see somewhere up in one of these slides, it looks like a sort of an odd garret with lots of desks and students working in it. We chose to rebel by saying we'll go and hire our own studio above a car repair place near the Victoria Market. We quickly painted all the walls to make it decent. It was rat infested, freezing cold in winter, stinking hot in summer, but 12 of us rented it, and we basically ran our major project together through that studio, and we just had an incredible collegiate learning experience doing that work together. So it's kind of interesting to me to compare that to the project we're working on, which I'm sure we'll get to later in the conversation, the new Student Precinct, where students are going to be provided with some pretty high quality places to hang out on campus, extended hours, sometimes 24/7, and really none of that was available. None of that was available at all. So you sort of self-organised, but in a sense that self-organising was part of your education. To be both well taught by some great staff like Jeff Turnbull, who many of you may know, and he's just recently published a great book on Walter Billy Griffin's Newman College. Hugh O'Neill in first year, it was kind of like a fixture, but fantastic. But there was a lot of learning between your peers, and then that'll lead to something else in our conversation about that half-time club and that sort of now called peer-to-peer learning, but you wouldn't have put that label to it at the time.
It was drink-to-drink learning, as I recall.
Drink-to-drink, yeah.
So tell us a little bit, Julie, about the halftime club. It's certainly been mentioned, and there's some sort of aspects that go into that. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about it.
Well, I went back to the source, so I didn't screw it up. I spoke to Grant Morani, who was in architecture school when we started. We actually had a studio with desks that were assigned, and most of the people in that set of desks stayed friends, oddly enough. But Grant started the halftime club. He felt that there was no bridge between school and practice, and we were all just beginning to get into practice. And a number of us worked in the same place, and he gave me the quote of what the halftime club said, and it's in my phone somewhere, but I'll pass on that. But he felt that there was a need for sort of critical discussion. And he said it was, as he put it, it was a pretty incredible time, because the idea of an Australian culture was emerging with popular culture. So Picnic at Hanging Rock and that whole genre, Peter Weir and all of those people, and then AC/DC and rock bands and the whole rock thing in pubs and all of this. And where was architecture? And Venturi's thinking had entered the system. It's like this was about place and vernacular and all of these things. And so he started to put a group together, and it turned out that the first meeting of the halftime club was where Hank and I were living, on Cardigan Street, and Steve Ashton was living. So he must have been at that first meeting too, given he was in the house. We were trying to work out who was there. We think there was about 15 people. I think Ian McDougall was there.
Howard Rager.
and Howard was there probably.
Yeah.
So we're all the same set of people with the same set, I don't know. Anyway, the deal was that Transition started, the magazine started around the same time, and that was deliberate, and that one was led by Richard Mundy and Ian McDougall. But anyhow, so back to Halftime. So Halftime started in our living room, and then within a couple of months, it moved to pubs around town. We left within 12 months of it starting and went to study in the States, and it continued. And as Grant put it, the participation was rowdy. So they got kicked out of one pub and had to keep moving to another because they were too aggressive and too noisy. But I think the conversation that came out of it has developed a distinctly Melbourne architecture, and we forget that those roots go back to that. Would you agree that it influenced?
Yeah, I mean, came to Halftime Club. I wasn't part of the foundation story.
You were too young.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, we're the same generation now, but of course, like when I was in first year, Julie's in final year, and it was like, the final year students doing all this amazing stuff, and you were like the kid at the front of the class, listening with all ears to what happened. But my first Halftime Club was not until 1981, so 2 years later when Glenn Murcutt was invited to come and talk to the Halftime Club. I mean, at that time, 1981, Glenn had been published in Transition magazine, which was like, ooh, published in Transition magazine. And he'd just done the Murray Short farmhouse, which is probably his most early celebrated work he did for a client, and then eventually bought it for himself, and now I think still lives there. So he came down to a pub, spoke at a pub in Smith Street. I can't remember the name of the pub, and there were probably 40 or 50 people there, but like it was a pretty intense evening. And what I'm going to just add to sort of Julie's comments, I mean, what some of you younger architects here don't realise, that the idea of practice, but theory and practice, was quite antithetical to like what was happening, say, in this school at the time. There was no courses, there was no discussion about the idea of architectural theory. You had history classes, which was the dutiful step-by-step, Western civilization history of architecture. The empire style moves to this style and that moves to this style. But the idea of talking about architecture in theoretical terms was almost like a sin, within the sort of professional niceties of what architecture is supposed to be in professional terms. So I think in part Halftime was to take on board the idea of theory, which was out and about in most other discussions and publications about architecture. You mentioned Robert Venturi, who sadly, as you would know, died a couple of weeks ago at the age of 93. So that idea of being able to speak to architecture as a constructed knowledge, theory, was really one of the other foundations of the Halftime Club. You had to stand up in front of your work and talk about it. So Glenn came down in a pub full of young, raucous Melbourne architects and talked about his work, and I must say, my memory is he talked about it extraordinarily eloquently, and he got a lot of respect for that. He was bold enough to say that he was seeking out an Australian architecture and laid out in his terms what he thought that meant and what he was doing with that in architectural terms. And he got some pretty intense questioning, but I think there's all...
As you do at the Halftime.
I want to ask a question, around that, because one of the interesting things about what you're speaking about is not just the conversations or the personalities, but it's a question of, it's something that we're very much interested in here, is this question of generating an architectural culture. And I guess the question is the degree to which it's that takes place through an institution like Melbourne School of Design, Faculty of Architecture, Building Plan, or it takes place through the students, or it takes place through the recent graduates, or it takes place through the young practitioners. And it's interesting because it sounds to me like, from the outside, that the story is really more generated from the student populace or the recent student populace than from the institution. And it sounds like you were in a sort of in-between, that the profession was maybe reactionary or uninterested, and the institution was institutionalized
Actually,
and
it was the
not
other
fitting
way.
in between.
It was actually the other way.
Okay.
There was, as he said, no design theory. Design instruction, although there were some good instructors, was pretty limited in terms of the feedback you got. You didn't construct a course in those days with a lot of input beyond setting a problem and letting people set to and do it. That's not how you do design studio now. There's a lot of input done to facilitate exploration. Practice, we all worked in interesting practices who had ideas about place, whether you would call them theoretical in the Venturi sense or not, but I mean, I worked at what was then Jackson and Walker. I then worked at Max May. Kevin Boland was in the building. There was a foot in the practice community. Peter Corrigan was a big deal. I mean, there was stuff afoot in the practice community that was much more interesting than what we got in school. But we didn't, I think part of Grant's thing was that he saw this and we as young architects weren't contributing to any discussion or taking it any further, not making it our own.
Yeah, well, I think it is that idea that you want to conduct a conversation. I mean, that's really, the culture sort of comes from the conversation, and the conversations may be different or may end up in different locations, but the fact that you're having the conversation is the critical thing. And again, I can sort of reflect back on what I was saying about theory. When I was studying in the 70s here, there was clear conflict between long-established staff I mentioned before. Many of them were post-war emigres from Europe, and they were pretty impressive people, but they were schooled in the lineage of Bauhaus. Before the war, they escaped war-torn Europe to make a new life in Australia, and they totally owned that idea of making architecture. I can remember having crits where it was absolutely form follows function. Like, why would you talk about anything else other than the functionality of the building, where the garbage comes in, where it goes out, all those sorts of things. And then conversely, you had this whole other conversation that was not really happening in the school. Maybe a couple of staff like Jeff Turnbull, I think, had studied with or done some work with Charles Moore at the time, who was a very interesting American architect. But postmodernism, so-called, got no airing at all within the school whatsoever, really. So there was this sort of weird tension between, the old modernists and the postmodern culture, which wasn't playing out in the school particularly. It was maybe the last lecture in a history course at the end of the semester. So in a sense, as students and then as young graduates, we had to find that conversation. And in a weird curiosity, where that conversation was happening was at Monash University. I mean, it's not disrespecting the traditions of this school, but Dr. Conrad Hayman, who many of you may know the name, who's now actually at RMIT. I mean, he was running an entire semester on postmodern architecture, a series of lectures, 13 lectures.
They didn't have an architecture program then, did
No,
they?
he was running that through the
the
art history school
okay.
with Professor Margaret Plant at the time. Professor Margaret Plant. And so we all used to trundle out to Monash, even though we're not Monash students, to sit in his lectures, because that was where you got this interesting conversation about postmodern architecture. So, I mean, I think the architectural cultural idea, clearly, Don, it's just completely diffused. It was coming from some institutional conversations. It was coming from some government policy. There were really smart people like David Yenkin, who was the senior bureaucrat who ran the Department of Planning in the late 70s, early 80s, and then Evan Walker, who was Darryl Jackson's first partner, went into politics, became the Minister for Planning, and he was intimately involved in the history of this school as well. So they were kind of conducting some kind of a cultural conversation about Melbourne.
I mean, you were talking about with the Halftime Club and transitions, that there was also a kind of, I wouldn't say a search, but there was a kind of discourse going on about Australian architecture,
Yep.
what might define it and stuff.
Yep.
And then you went off to America.
Yeah.
Your brother went to Pennsylvania and
Yep.
spent time and worked for Venturi.
Yep.
What was the sort of push-pull going on, I think, particularly between America and Australia at that time, but also, you know, where did Melbourne or Australia architecture in general feel that it fit within the larger context of world architecture?
Mm.
I mean, was it always, well, I'll let you answer how it...
Well, I mean, I feel like at that time it was, you know, a very conscious reaction to the idea of, you know, call it a generic international modernism being taught in this school and other schools and being probably pervasive within the profession. And therefore there was, you know, a desire to try and find some other way of thinking about architecture, and then that led to these, you know, various diffused different conversations around the town.
So we came back 83 or 84 and talked to the Halftime Club. So this is kind of an interesting record. And I don't think the self-confidence of Australian practice then was not the self-confidence of Australian practice now. So be careful that you don't misinterpret what I'm saying. But they gave us a grilling. We came and we talked about stuff we'd been doing in the States, and it was design algorithms. And there wasn't any really nifty software at that time. We were actually doing algorithms and outcomes manually because the software wasn't sophisticated enough to handle it. And basically you'd sold out because it was machine-led. So the discussions about science downstairs, about CRISPR gene things, that came back to me, and it's like, well, maybe it's not so bad if I work out what it can do. It's about how we use it, not what it is. But anyhow, so that was the beginning. And then it was that you went to the States, you sold out. And that argument, after a couple of drinks, got louder and really irritating. And I was kind of pleased to go back because I was free. Now, the issue of going to another country by choice, not because you have to, is you are outside of the system that you're used to judging you. And you can do whatever you like. And no one's going to say anything, including your parents. You know, it's liberating. And I've always liked the idea of being an outsider. I didn't really want to belong to the club. And so I find this idea of an Australian architecture, especially in the context of what's going on in the world in terms of immigration and stuff, really confusing. And I'm uncomfortable with it. But then again, when you see the results of the architecture, it's incredibly liberating. So I don't know how to solve this issue. Do you have any insight? Help me.
Yeah, but yeah, I think at the time, you know, to return to your question, like at the time and say the late 70s, early 80s, it was a completely legitimate conversation to have because of this, you know, the sort of generic model of still holding sway over the profession is to say, well, we don't want to speak in a generic international language, we want to speak in a distinctive local language. And that was, of course, the rhetoric of Peter Corrigan and his work, and in a different way, Glenn Murcutt, to be honest. So it was, a very self-assertion of a national identity in a positive way, and like there were some fantastic things that came out of it. In fact, I remember coming to a Halftime Club when Halftime Club got properly organised a little bit later, and people used to put in money and seek sponsorship and have formal meetings, which for a whole day, and the club booked out the Seiselcraft Theatre, which is the predecessor of this theatre in the old building, and ran a day session on what is Australian architecture, and invited Philip Cox down from Sydney. You know, he'd at that time was probably best known for a couple of books he wrote, you know, with Wesley Fox about old colonial towns in Australia, and he'd sort of written a lot about Australian architecture. And Shane Murray, who's now Dean of Architecture and Design at Monash University, spoke, and Richard Munday, who was one of the founding editors of Transition, spoke, and Ivor Indyk, who subsequently went to New York and had a great sort of cultural studies history as well. but it was like a day of debating it. What is it? You know, why is it important? So like I think it was interesting at the time to do that, and maybe that lasted for a few years, and then you know, the debate moved on, and now you can look back on it. It's all sort of a bit nationalistic and a bit strange, but it seemed like a very worthy
It was an important
debate at the
transition.
time. And
But
now you don't really. I mean, now what's interesting is like since that time you've had the complete swing to globalisation, and now there's almost like the swing back to
Closed borders.
to the local. You know, I mean, like what's interesting about Julie's practice is like how oddly local it is to Los Angeles in so many ways, and you could look at even a influential architect like Robert Venturi and say, in his bones he's a Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Or you can look at Rem Koolhaas and say, in his bones he's Dutch. Or you can look at Frank Gehry and say, no matter what he does around the world, he's also carries Los Angeles in him everywhere. And that's, so, you know, I think we're almost like back to a cycle where we could be brave enough to say, what is an Australian, not what is an Australian architecture, like what is a Melbourne architecture?
Mm-hmm.
You know, make it actually much more specific.
Well, so then how do you address issues that are bigger than place, like sustainability and stuff like that? Because of all the weird things that I took from here to the States was I can't remember their names. I can remember their nicknames, which I'm not going to use because I'm sure they're still around and that's not going to be polite.
Whisper them to me and I'll get going.
Spider legs. Anyhow, but we got a pretty good education on sustainability. And we got a pretty good education on materials in a way that I've not actually seen taught anywhere else around the places I've been teaching.
Yeah.
And it was quite detailed so that you had technical information about how to use things responsibly, and you had an idea of what environmental responsibility was. And that was way before its time. When I went to the States and people were arguing for it and it wasn't popular in the 80s, I was surprised how behind they were in some of that kind of stuff. And then the other part about going somewhere else, and I don't know, it's the same, I guess, coming here new, is whatever you learnt somewhere else, no one thinks counts. You know, it's like, so, oh yes, you learned that in Australia, that's nice, you still need to do that class again, or whatever it is that you're doing. And I'm sure you guys do the same to people who come here.
Yeah, totally.
Let me ask a little bit now about not about the new student precinct per se, but you're doing the new student precinct as part of a larger team and stuff. This building was produced by a Melbourne architect with a Boston architect, working on a kind of 24-hour cycle or thereabouts, sending documents back and forth electronically and so on and so forth. What's it like in this consortium of architects? First of all, it's a big mix, but also, you know, the two of you who are doing some of the major components, how do you operate between yourselves and between the rest of the group?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting about that, Don, is you know, if you sort of take the Melbourne architectural culture as being this idea of being able to talk about architecture, to conduct a discourse and maybe do it in a civil way, even if you have quite opposing views, although, you know, the history of Halftime Club was littered with very uncivil interactions as well. It toughened everybody up. But I mean, what's interesting is in working as a consortium, and I think it's been fantastic working with Julie and others, is to say, well, the overall vision of the project is in a sense hard won by lots of conversations amongst the bigger team to do it by, and consensus is not a great word because it sounds like compromise,
Yeah,
but it's not really consensus, but it's to say everyone looks into a project with a slightly different perspective, but then if you actually find a way to creatively add those different perspectives together, you actually get a kind of more interesting outcome from it than maybe a more monolithic singular perspective. So I mean, that's the approach we used on the project, even in the very fast time when we were originally working on the design competition, and Julie was out for that, as was Hank, I think, at the time. And then subsequently, as the project has been developed and each practice has taken on, one building or a couple of building components, then, the distinctive sensibilities, start to come into play in much more architectural terms. So it's kind of interesting, you get the conversation and an outcome from the conversation, but at the same time, you do in the end get, a genuinely diverse series of responses in architectural terms, which we think as an aggregate adds up to some interesting reinforcement of the model of this campus, because this campus is, there's lots of different, it's not like a perfect sandstone university of perfectly formed equal buildings. It's an uneven building stock, but what joins it together is the landscape. So we've tried to find that balance as well, to get landscape thinking very much in the foreground of the design of the precinct, as well as the buildings in architectural terms.
I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience in just a minute, so please have one in mind, otherwise I'll just make something else up. But following on from exactly what you were just saying, you're both graduates from here, you're both alumni from the University of Melbourne, you both spent considerable time, some longer than others. What does the university need to do after your project? So it's not about what your project's going to do for the university or within the university. Coming from the outside, coming from very different points, Carey, you've done lots of academic buildings around Australia, not just in Melbourne. Julie, you've had lots of experiences in other places, like in the States and LA. What, as a kind of thinking forward, what do you think is important to establish University of Melbourne beyond what it's already known for?
This is sort of below the surface. I feel that we're taking away risk. And I think it's something that kids have worked so hard to get here that they don't want to risk anything to lose the leg up that's given them. And I think risk is really important. And I think that means risk in the way you use a building as much as I think it means risk in the way you approach an academic future. I'm interested in seeing how universities are taking on more ideas about research of ideas that corporations in the past have had responsibility for, and I think that's really interesting. But I don't know what it means to do that, but I just feel that it's too safe. I don't mean it should be physically, that you should, get yourself killed or whatever. But I think risk needs to be encouraged.
I'd probably take a more directly discipline-specific approach to answering that question. I was very interested to read, your recently retired Vice-Chancellor's recent book, which was called The Idea of an Australian University, or some similar turn of phrase, I can't remember. And he, I thought it was a very interesting book for those that have been around the sector for a while. But what he characterised Australian universities as being is traditionally metropolitan universities. So University of Melbourne would service the needs of, it's the top university in Melbourne, even local students would come for that reason. And then the transformation to a top 50 global university, and now with more than 50% of the income into the university coming from international students, you get this very interesting tension in a positive sense between the global university and the local university. And I think the interesting question for a university such as Melbourne is to say, how does that play out in architectural and urban design terms to bring it back to our discipline? So on the one hand, you could say, the university could be commissioning the best international architects around the world to come and do buildings on the campus, the university could be fostering local talent that has been trained in the halls of this building and take a very local approach. I mean, the truth, of course, can lie somewhere in between, but I would certainly be saying that, in the long term, to try and make a very specific local experience for students, because that's what students are looking out for, and that's certainly what we hope we can achieve in the Student Precinct. What's interesting to us is having been as you said, we've been designing campus buildings for a long time, and 15 years ago, as online learning took off and MOOCs, so-called MOOCs, happened, then everyone was putting a question mark against what is the role of a university campus. Everyone can just access content in a virtual way, so the geography of a campus is not that critical. But in fact, what has happened in the last 10 years is the opposite's true, that the availability of content online has sort of almost pushed content not into the background. Of course, scholarship is always going to be the primary thing in a university, but the flip side is that it's actually made place much more important on a campus. So a student chooses to go to this university because of the place, the experience of the place, or chooses to go to RMIT, as a sort of more inner metropolitan campus, or chooses to go to wherever in Australia or indeed internationally. And to me and to the practice, that's fantastic for architects, because that's a great conversation to be a part of, and it's absolutely true. That's why students are selecting to come. I mean, obviously this is a great university in every metric, but it's a pretty fantastic campus and a pretty fantastic location to want to come and spend some time in.
Okay, questions? I think we have one down at the front here. Just getting a mic down to you, Jeff.
Thanks very much. Julie, I was really interested in what you were saying earlier on, that you felt that you had been well taught around sustainability and were well equipped coming from that. And it's very clear in some of the projects that you've done that I've seen in the lecture you gave last year, that you embrace it, and it's an important part of your business. I have a question for both of you, which is really about saying where we are at the moment as a planet isn't a particularly good place to be, with global warming and so on, extreme weather events.
Go on.
And Trump, particularly, yes. The two are related.
Yeah.
Not very popular in the commune of Santa Monica.
No.
I'm interested to know whether you think that architects have a moral responsibility to design for what is coming ahead, and how well you think architectural schools at the moment prepare people for an architecture of a different climatic world than we have at the moment, and that's going to change quite radically.
All right. I actually think that sustainability is acted on by architects, but it's policy and regulation that will make a difference. The thing about sustainability that I think made it unpopular is that people thought that if you do buildings that are sustainable, they either won't have a narrative to tell, or they won't have an identity, because it's going to be so practical. But I actually think it's enabled a lot of experimentation. So from a design point of view, I think it's an asset, not a problem. Just to tell you how far the regulations are going in our little city of Santa Monica, which does a lot of things not so well, but has a pretty strong sustainability policy. So California itself is accelerating its net zero goals, and I can't remember what date they're starting in, but Santa Monica has projects under 4 stories now have to be net zero by 2020. So you can't do buildings after 2020 that are not net zero. That's energy, not water, but water's a whole other discussion. And then the whole carbon emissions thing ties on a bit to the net zero, but it's, you know what it's tricky, and it's not so easy to do. And we'll see how that plays out, but that's where it's got to come from, because that means that your client is on board from the beginning. You don't have to rely on the enlightened client to do something, and it changes the way the industry makes things and does things.
Jeffrey, thank you for that first question. I'd expect nothing less from you. But if the question is, do I think students are well taught for that? I'm not teaching in the school at the moment, so I can't answer that question in relation to this school. But I think, broad brush, the answer would be yes. I think there's always that tension between any university having to, build, or call them practice-ready, employable graduates, and therefore, to set some reasonable parameters about what can be achieved in sustainable terms in a professional life, and that's often slightly at odds with the experimental side of things. I mean, I think the profession in Australia, the discipline of architecture, has matured at an incredibly rapid rate over the last decade, and almost like reached another plateau. We can all agree on 6-star Green Star, which is platinum lead, and so on and so forth, and neighbours. So it's like, what is the next thing? And I think it is that whole idea of how do you change sustainable culture. I think one of the other, bring it back to the new Student Precinct, one of the great things about the project in terms of the feedback in the so-called co-creation process with students is how sustainability is absolutely at the front of mind of students on the campus. And so that's the generation, for those of you who are here, to say, well, you're going to implement the next level of maturity of the discipline of architecture or the construction industry by changing the culture. We had a great example when we had our first big team meetings of all the architects in our practice, and we have, as you know, Breathe Architecture on our team, and Jeremy McLeod is a fantastic architect. Many of you know their work from the Commons or Nightingale, which are extraordinary paradigm-shifting projects. And he walked into the first meeting and completely shamed everybody that either had a plastic water bottle or a disposable coffee cup. And next meeting promptly handed out not keep cups, but Joko cups to everyone on the team, free of charge. So that's just like one small example to say...
You didn't send me one.
That's right. Is to say, it's not always just about the sunshades and the systems and the facades. It is about culture change. So in the new Student Precinct, we would love to see, an operational overlay, looking at the project directors here, to say no disposable coffee cups in the new Student Precinct, or to say we're going to sort organic waste and create renewable energies out of that waste, and students are going to own the decision to put their stuff into that bin and not that bin. So like that to us is the next frontier. There's a lot of culture change involved with that, but it's actually the students who will lead that culture change, and it's actually the institution that's got to catch up with the It's the institution that's got to catch up with the students to make that work.
Which is
in
more
a good
risk.
way.
Yeah.
Another question? There's one at the back.
Thank you very much to all the Melbourne Uni organisers for today's historical event about the new Student Precinct. My name is Connie, Melbourne Uni graduate in education 7 years ago. And then over the 24 years living in Melbourne, I have actually experienced the last 2 or 3 years, the most amazing discovery. I've recommended to so many people because I discover apple cider vinegar. So I make drinks with lime and also honey, and that helps me to not to see the doctor for the last few years. And I actually talking about uni landscape. I really seriously recommend to plant a few lime trees. No more London plane tree. They hurt people so many years. London plane tree. 75% of the public trees I read about in Australia are London plane trees, and they actually cause in my opinion, hay fever and make people suffer so much. I live in the area. I discovered the most delighted discovery to see a public lime tree, and they grow beautiful fruit and smell great.
So we
Right.
have heard from students that there is feedback and interest in sort of
okay.
on-site
Yeah.
vegetable growing and herbs and all this other kind of stuff. So I think it's already in the system, but we haven't added limes specifically to the list, and we'll pass it on. Thank you.
Other question? Yeah, this one. Sorry, back. Just so you can run up and down. This is about the exercise.
Thank you. Carey, you mentioned very quickly job ready. I was just wondering, and it's a question to all three of you, where you
Junk
see the
ready?
line between
Job ready.
in education between the institution and industry. What does job ready mean, and is it dangerous, and what's best taught at university and what's best taught in industry?
Well, I've got a strong. I'm
Well,
sure we
go
both
for
have
it. If
strong
you-
views on that.
You-
I mean, as a practice, we in no way think a student graduating after 5 years, bachelor and masters, is fully ready to practice architecture. So we're not. I mean, of course, you need to do some underlying stuff, but we don't really care that much if a student has done a course in specification writing. I'd be honest.
God, that'd be
What we
nice.
want them to graduate with is independent minds, great design sensibilities, probably knowledge in latest technologies. If in doubt, if you have a technology question, ask someone under the age of 25. But that independent mind is the most important thing. And, I think Julie sort of said, maybe that's the sort of thing in education that's harder to do these days. And there's a lot of pressure on, fee-paying students, to sort of get through their course, and maybe the experimental side of things is slightly diminished into the background. But that's certainly our view, and we assume that, within a couple of years of working in the practice, if graduates can get the right all-round experience and all the stuff that's more specific to the practice of architecture will come their way in any case.
I think Australian and European architects are better trained technically, so there's a threshold of, there's a balance. But nonetheless, what you're saying is correct. The most value out of an architectural education that you can take to practice is people who think. And so yes, on that we agree. I also have a problem though that we're training people for 3, let's say you've done the graduate program, that's 3 years plus 4 years. I don't know what it is here.
No, it's 3 plus 2.
3 plus 2. It's a long time to go to school. You should be able to, do surgery in that time. So the deal is that for a lot of the skill sets, we're overtraining people, and we could integrate. It used to be drafts people that were really fantastic assets in a team, and people who've done this much school, the 5-7 years, 7 in the US, right? Years of school, you want to move up in your place much faster, and there is a shortage of people to do the day-to-day work that gets a project documented, especially in an era of over-documentation, because unfortunately 3D modeling programs haven't reduced the amount of work we do, they've just increased the amount of detail that we're responsible for. So we're doing a lot more. So I think there's 2 answers to your question.
I want to thank you.
Thank you. You can
I
tell-
want to, I mean, I think particularly for me, there are these three aspects. There's this issue of producing thinkers, deep thinkers, based on questioning, but also being willing to take risks. And so I hope on behalf of the university, and in fact on behalf of the greater Melbourne, that what we get with the new Student Precinct is a consequence of deep thinking, truly questioning, and real risk taking in order to produce a new academic experience for universities of the 21st century. So thank you to Professor Carey Lyon, to Dr. Julie
Yeah.
Eizenberg, and thank you all very much for coming this evening and for participating in the end of today's New Student Precinct Festival. Thank you very much.
Thank you.